Pledge of Allegiance today. Any volunteers? How about Julie? Oh, Lee is gonna, okay, thank you, Lee. Okay.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
To the flag
of
of the United States of America,
and to
and
the
to the
republic for which it stands,
one nation,
nation,
under God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty
and justice for all.
We did that great.
No,
We're better in person.
Yes, we are.
We'll do better when we get in person.
Yeah.
I was just thinking I should put up an image of an American flag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that would be lovely.
That'd be great.
and we're just starting. Is there any public comment? We don't have public comment, so we'll move on to the consent agenda. Is there any discussion on the minutes, the retirement report? We have the April and May financial reports. Is there any discussion, questions, comments about the consent agenda? Seeing none, let's move on to regarding the adoption of the triennial actuarial experience study. So we're gonna Andy Young come in, right?
Yeah, and Paul Angelo is also online, so I'm going to bring them both in here.
Great, okay.
So I'm just going to remind folks to please mute yourselves unless you're speaking.
Can I ask a question real quick? This is Sherry.
Yeah, sure.
So my phone rings and I can't stop it. So, and it could ring. So are you going to mute us during because we should be muted, right?
Yeah.
We can mute ourselves, right? Can we we can mute ourselves, like Quincy was saying. Last time we had a problem, but this time we can actually mute ourselves.
Yeah, it seems to be working on my end. If you have
Okay.
Alt A is the shortcut on my keyboard.
If you just click on where your picture is, it'll give you options.
So you're muted. Yeah, Sherry, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome Andy and Paul.
Good morning.
Morning.
We're excited to hear from you.
I will occasionally turn my picture off because in order for me to see stuff on my laptop, I have to do this and it scares people. So,
It's understandable.
yeah, it scares me.
Oh, okay. So we're ready.
So are we, I'm sorry, I just came in. So have we been called to order and all that stuff?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So it's our turn. I don't know, would any of the board members want to kick this off or should we just jump in?
Just jump in, I think.
All right, here we go.
Catherine,
All right,
I was going to ask if you want to introduce Doris to Andy and Paul.
Okay, that's a good idea. So
guess what? We know Doris.
Oh,
Yeah, we worked with Doris at Fresno, Sarah, for many years, and we're delighted to be working with her here. But welcome, Doris.
Thank you.
Very well.
Thank you.
Get the screen share for you guys set up so you can share.
Very good. So let me open up the document because I find that with Zoom, you have to have it open before you try to share it. And I will go share screen and I will do that leaning into the camera thing like I do. And there it is. And we're going to share that. And I am going to, oh, where is that thing? I guess I have to, I'm going to put my little picture up there. There we go. Okay. And let me move the little, those guys out of the way. So I hope you can see the screen there. We see the, just the cover page of the, we call it the 2020, but it's the 2016 through 2019 actuarial experience study for Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association. I'm Paul Angelo with Siegel, and I'm joined with my colleague Andy Young. And we do this every 3 years as required by the state statute to do what's called an experience study. We are not, I'm going to go through the economic parts and Andy will do the demographic parts. I'm not going to go and read the whole report to you, but I will walk through the the economics, because that's usually the one that gets the most discussion.
Yeah. Now, Paul, I will,
Andy,
if I
go
may
ahead.
stop you, I
Go
think sometimes we run into some technical difficulties, and this is one of those. I think we bring up the versions with the draft watermark on it, but it should be the same as the final. I think the final report was dated June 11th, and I don't think there were any changes between the
My
draft and the
mistake.
final.
I'm sorry. I apologize. So this is the one that I had in my desktop, and of course this is not the final. I can switch that out. I will ask the chair. It wouldn't take me long, but it is exactly the same document. Do you have any objection if we proceed with this with the understanding? Andy, tell me the date of the final again.
June 11th.
Okay, so the one you have in your packet says June 11th, but it has no changes from that copy to this copy. Madam Chair, is it okay if we proceed with this one?
Absolutely, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andy, thank you for that.
No problem.
All right. So in the first page here, we talk about, the difference between the annual evaluation and the experience study. The annual evaluation we do every year, and we compare each year what actually happened, the actual plan experience, with what was assumed, and we compare the two, and we even quantify that difference. We call it the actuarial gain or loss for that single year. But we don't change the assumptions every year. But every 3 years, what we do is we actually go through each assumption, compare it to experience, not just for the most recent year, but for the most recent 3 years, and sometimes 6 years or 9 years. So sometimes we'll gather even more data. And the idea is, let's say, for example, that your members are living longer than is predicted by your mortality assumption. Well, each year when those members don't die, it's good for them, but it actually increases your liabilities. And we would recognize that loss each year. But eventually, you want to change the assumption. So instead of having little losses show up in each future year, you sort of almost like capitalizing all those losses today. When you change the assumptions, you're really revising your estimate of future experience rather than an evaluation where all you do is recognize each year of future experience compared to what is assumed. So that's what our process is. Andy, any comments so far?
No, we're doing very well so far.
And I will also pause, Madam Chair, occasionally for questions from the board. Real quick here, this is a summary, and you'll see this it's on page 6 of the report. This is a summary of all the recommended assumption changes. This doesn't explain why we're doing it. Of course, that comes up in the body of the report. But probably the one that everybody talks about is we are going to be reducing the inflation assumption from 3% to 2.75. And that then leads to a reduction in the investment return assumption from 7% to 6.75. So that's probably the most significant, or at least the best understood of the changes. Now, by lowering inflation, we are also going to lower our estimates of future salary growth. So we'll be assuming that on average, salaries increase by 3.25% per year. That's 275 price inflation and 50 basis points, what we call real wage growth. Then we also look at how individual members advance in their careers. That's what we call the merit and promotion. We look at that as well. So that's the economic assumptions. Then we get into the demographic assumptions. And again, the one that's getting the most discussion in pension plans is we're going to new mortality tables. We'll get to that in a second. First of all, we are adjusting our prediction of when members will retire. And then now on the next page, this is the mortality one. We currently use what is called, I'll go down here, what's called a static projection of future mortality improvement. But as we told you 3 years ago, what was coming down the pike is going to what's called a generational improvement in mortality. So we're recommending that this year. And then also we are adopting these brand new Pub 2010. And you might say, if they're brand new, why do they call it 2010? That's the center year where the data was collected, but these tables didn't really come out until 2016. And so we'll be recommending those tables as well. These are nationally developed tables based exclusively on public sector experience. So that's the big, that's sort of the big demographic change. And then we tweak all the others, the termination rates, disability incidents, unused sick leave, vacation cash house, really all the different assumptions that we make. And then since we always think trustees should know what the impact of their decisions is on their stakeholders, we estimate what the cost impact will be. You can see, I find it quite interesting that the inflation assumption going from 3 to 275 and the investment return assumption going from 7 to 6.75 actually cancel each other out at a relatively modest cost increase. I mean, if you've seen our actuarial reports from year to year, 0.15 is almost at the noise level. So that really is almost a break-even set of assumptions. However, for the demographic assumptions, there is a material cost impact of about 2.33% of pay. And I think down here, we make the observation that of the demographic assumptions, about half of that cost impact is from this component of the salary increases, what I call demerit and promotion, and the other half is from the change in mortality. So now I'm going to go through the economic assumptions in some detail, and then Andy will go through the demographics. So without getting into why we're doing this, because we haven't got to that, just at the overview level, I want to pause for any questions from the members of the board or comments from Andy.
I would like you to refer to a page when you're discussing something, please, so we can be sure that we're right there with what you want us to be looking at.
Thank you very much. It's a very good suggestion. So this here is what's page 9. That's where we have this little text, and then this is page 8 where we have that summary cost. I will try to do that. And Andy, if I forget, please feel free to shout in to remind the trustees what page I'm on. Okay.
Absolutely.
That's especially important for the one who's called in and she doesn't have the computer screen.
Oh, well, okay. So I'll be sure to do that. Thank you, Doris.
So I just want to say that when I'm looking at what we have in our packet, the page numbers are slightly different, like the cost impact of recommended assumptions on what I'm looking at is on page 7, so that they don't coordinate.
Oh, okay. Okay. Andy, I think that might have been, because I noticed that on my copy, just give me just 1 second here. I
think you you're right that while the content has not changed from the draft to the final report, but we did correct an error with the page numbering. So this is my fault. So all the page numbers, when we refer to the page number, especially for you, Paul, you have to subtract 1 from that number. So to make things even more confusing for everybody.
All right. Well, then in that case, this is only going to take me 1 second. I'm going to grab the more recent copy. Just give me 1 second here. And I do apologize for this. Let's see, go to Outlook, and go to there, and go to Mendocino. And you remind me what was the date of the final report, please?
Yes, it's June the 11th.
All right. Let's see here. And we have June 11. And the final report. Thank you. And okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and now June 11th, look at that. Okay, and now thank you very much. Just to confirm here, the cost impact is now on page 7.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right, are there any other questions or comments? These have been really helpful so far.
I have a question.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. What impact do you think this financial crisis for all levels of society, including government, and the printing of money to pay for it, what do you think the long-term impact of that's going to be on inflation?
Well, I will tell you for our study.
That's a new game.
Yeah, exactly. For our study, we are assuming there will be no long-term impact, and one, because long-term really means long-term. The other is at least in our study, you'll see that we're recommending a 2.75 price inflation. Now, that is actually still fairly high compared to recent years. And if you talk to market economists who use the financial markets as a predictor of inflation, they would say that's actually too high. So we already have built into our assumption the possibility that there may be times when inflation is greater than it is today. It couldn't be much less than it is today, just because of the way the Fed has been managing things. But more broadly, we get asked that question quite a bit. On the demographic side, we think that in the short term, there are going to be offsetting effects. There are going to be, we obviously have a spike in mortality. And since we cover retirees, and retirees are in the age group that's most affected by COVID-19, that will actually cause gains because, again, additional mortality lowers liability. On the other side, we will likely see some increase in presumptive death benefits and presumptive disability benefits. And so that would go the other direction. But we don't think that those are going to be long-term effects. On the economic side, I think back to 2008, 2009, when we had, if anything, a more severe downturn as far as investment markets. And we used our 5-year smoothing techniques to bring those losses into the liabilities. They went into the employer's contribution rates. And it was expensive, but we have weathered that storm, and it didn't really change our long-term forecast. So our short answer is, we think that actuarial experience is effectively going to leap over COVID-19 and get to a new normal. Now, we don't know what that new normal will be. We don't have anything right now that would compel us to try to predict it one way or another. So we think that our long-term inflation assumption is probably going to continue to come down in the future. But it was going to anyway. But we really don't see anything in COVID-19, either on the demographic side or the economic side, that compels us to explicitly modify our long-term forecasts.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So this assumption is for 3 years, and I assume it's to go into effect July 1 of this year. So the next 3 fiscal years. Is that true?
Well, for 2 things. First, we think of these assumptions actually as being your long-term assumptions until they're changed. They will be reviewed again in 3 years. But in effect, unless they are changed in the future, they will last forever. But they will be reviewed again in 3 years. Now, the timing. We will use these assumptions in the June 30, 2020 actuarial valuation. However, those changes in rates will not go into effect until June 30 or July 1, 2021. There's a 1-year lag between the date of the valuation and the date the rates go into effect. So this cost impact here, even though we estimated it based on the June 30, 2019 valuation, you can see my pointer there. And first of all, when we use these new assumptions in the 2020 valuation, the cost impact may be slightly different than shown here because it is a new valuation 1 year later. But the contribution rates based on these new assumptions will not go into effect until June 30, 2021.
Thank you. So for the reason I'm bringing this up is the county went through a period of where salaries were increasing at a slower rate than was in the assumptions. And so that was reflecting to the positive each year into the fund. This last year, because we began a much needed 3-year contract, which was bringing employees up to market or close to market, there's substantially more than 3% increases in salaries across the board. So the minimum that any employee would get is 3%. As a COLA, but most employees are getting substantially more than that each of the next 3 years. So for the first of these 3 years that this will be in effect, there will still be that increase for many employees that it will be above 3%, and the rest will still have 3%. We just adopted a budget. We're in the process of adopting a budget that implements the second year of that increase. Obviously can't predict maybe quite out the following fiscal year, but the county's been trying to find savings in other ways to fully implement the salary program. So I'm just saying that effectively 1 of the 3 years that this would be in effect, there's going to be higher salaries than increases than 2.75 for sure.
Right, right. Now we will cover that again when we get to the section on the salary assumption. We actually try to filter that out and focus only on in the salary, in what's called the merit and promotion assumption, is people who are getting raises above the averages. So we're trying to get people who are moving up in step or advancing in grade.
But this has nothing to do with people moving in their position, although that's an important factor for you to consider. This is just all classifications were evaluated in the market, and almost all were found to be substantially below the market, and they're being brought up in a 3-year contract, so they are very close to market.
Right. So what, so that will show up when we do the actual valuation, and we compare actual salary increases to assumed salary increases. You will have salary losses. That is, you will have an unexpected increase in liability due to unexpected extraordinary salary increases. Just as back after 2008, 2009, we had a number of years where there were very few salary increases, and then you had salary gains. That does not affect the long-term assumption, but it will definitely show up in each valuation as either a gain or a loss. And what it sounds like you're telling us is, based on these recent agreements, we can expect to see some salary losses. Again, good for the members, increases liability, see some salary losses because we'll be seeing salary increases on average growing greater than the 3.25%. Does that sound like we're saying the same thing?
Yes, but it's not really unanticipated, as my point.
Okay, it is. I'm sorry. It's not anticipated in our actual assumptions. Again, because our assumptions tend to be long-term, things which only which are sort of one-time adjustments that are not part of the ongoing salary expectations are treated as experience items in each valuation.
Yeah, I guess my point is, because it's not unanticipated, we can anticipate it. Wouldn't we want to factor that in, even though it's only going to be for the first of the 3 years of that this will be in effect without any changes?
Again,
maybe I can
go ahead, Andy. Yeah, help us out.
I know when I present the valuation report last November, the board raised exactly the same concern. Thank you to the trustees for raising those concerns. So what I think we have decided to do is, whereas, as Paul has mentioned, these are long-term assumptions. So rather than to reflect that short-term deviance from the assumptions in the assumption setting process, the board has asked SACRS, when we come back to you, actually next month, we'll be coming back to you with a risk report. So risk report very quickly is there to provide the trustees and other stakeholders with what could potentially happen if there was short-term deviation of actual experience, such as higher salary increases in the short term compared to these long-term assumptions. So we are going to come back to the board at the next meeting in July. And the reason why we felt it's important to wait to not have the risk report be presented to you in the same day is because we just want to make sure that we find out what the board is going to approve as far as long-term assumptions are concerned. But as part of that analysis, we have been working with staff in trying to isolate what those bargaining agreements would call for in terms of salary increases, to the extent that they have not been reflected in the data that Paul was mentioning that we have used for this analysis. So yes, so we will be bringing back to you in July basically an illustration, a projection of what the next valuation will bring, especially when the higher than expected salary increase, even when compared to these projected assumptions, is going to show up in the data. So yes, we will bridge that gap by including those analysis in our risk report.
So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it seems like it would just be prudent not to adjust the assumed salaries upward, but just to retain you have a 3% is an existing assumption, and you're proposing to drop it to 2.75. Why not just keep it at 3% for the next 3 years, and then, if merited, drop it to 2.75 going forward in 3 years from now?
Well, one reason is, remember, we use this assumption as a long-term assumption. So for example, when we are structuring your employer's amortization payments, we assume that those payments, we calculate them as a level percentage of pay. So we assume that those payments are going to increase at 3.25% per year through your entire amortization period. I get it. Because these are long-term assumptions, we tend to let things that are only going to be true for a short period of time show up in the experience and continue to base the assumption on the longer-term expectation. And I think this is something that we do encounter fairly often, because we have a lot of places where, you know, part of the employee membership will sign a contract that tells what the contractual salary increases will be, you know, for a 3-year period. And the question is, you know, why don't you have 2 sets of assumptions, one for the next 3 years and one for the longer term? And the reason that we don't do that is that we're trying to get a cost that remains level. And the way for the cost to remain level is to use a consistent set of assumptions and then let the short-term events show up in the actual experience. But then, as Andy says, that doesn't mean that we cannot let you and your stakeholders know what to expect from that short-term experience. It's just that we want for example, the salary growth assumption to be one that's appropriate for your entire amortization period, rather than have it change, have one period of salary growth, meaning one pattern of amortization payments for the short time, and then a different pattern for a longer time.
So I just want to also add that in past years, the amortization calculations included the annual salary increase or 3-year salary increase that we hadn't even caught up to. So it's just when you look backwards, there were the calculations included salary increases that we didn't get at the time. So we got them all at once now. So it's kind of like a catch up.
Right. And going back to, was that Mr. Jurdy that was talking?
Yeah.
I don't have my things open here. Who was asking the question?
I was initially that was the chair.
Okay, yeah.
But prior to that, I was questioning
Yes. Yeah.
Why move it down now at a time when we know the salaries are going up.
Yeah, and again, building on the chair's comment, it's the flip side of it's why we didn't move it down after 2008, even though we had fairly predictable periods of low salary growth. We let those show up as gains. So again, we just tend not to adjust the assumptions to try to track short-term events. And it was helpful for the chair to mention that we saw just the inverse of this, just the opposite of this, during the periods of low salary growth not too long ago.
I guess I would be less concerned if we had a surplus, or the fund was balanced.
I note your concern, trustee, but again, I just keep going back to saying the same thing over and over. We tend to focus on the long term, and the short term, whether it is favorable to the plan or unfavorable to the plan, we tend to accept that in the annual gains and losses. Okay, any other questions? Madam Chair, hearing none, I will proceed to the detail parts.
Okay.
So I'm going to scroll up to, so I'm now, I'm walking through page 9 and page 10, where we talk again about how, how we do these studies. We compare actual demographic experience to the assumptions and then make adjustments. We'll see examples of that as we go through. But I really want to go to now the economic assumptions. We're going to talk about 3 economic assumptions: price inflation, investment return, and salary increases, and they're all interconnected.
So we are on page 11, right, Paul?
And we are now on page 11, yes. Page 11, where we start with the economic assumptions. So we're going to first talk about price inflation. Price inflation is not an easy thing to predict over the very long term. There's a technique that we have used for many, many years in the years that Andy and I have been working together. It's becoming less and less useful, but we still include it in the report. We may start scaling this down, but what we used to do is look at long averages of actual price inflation from 1930 to 2019. And we do rolling 15-year average or moving 15-year averages. So we look at the last 15 years, then we look at the 15 years starting a year ago, and then 15 years starting 2 years ago. We calculate average inflation for each of those different 15-year periods, put it on a list and see which one what shows up as the middle one, what shows up at the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile. We do the same thing with 30-year moving averages. But the thing is, all of these are substantially higher than what we're expecting to see in inflation going forward. Part of that is because they still are influenced by the very high inflation that we had in the mid-1970s and early 1980s. So all they really tell us now is that compared to historical experience for inflation, the recent experience is much lower. So next thing we look at is we look and see what other retirement systems are assuming. NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Associations, does a survey of these. There's a 1 year lag, but for that big survey, the median, which is the one in the middle, was 2.65%. That means they're probably mostly either at 2.75 or at 2.5. CalSTRS and 14 other 37 Act systems like yours use 2.75 already. 2 of them use 2.5, 2 of the SURL systems, and then Mendocino and 3 others are still at 3%. And I can tell you that all those others are also in the process of reviewing that assumption. CalPERS lowered theirs to 2.5%. So it's kind of a general cluster for pension systems in California, most at 2.75, but some at 2.5. Your investment consultant uses 2.25. And the average of, we do a survey of 7 investment advisory firms, that average is 2.3. But as I noted, the investment firms, one, tend to be more market focused, using market-based projections of inflation, which tend to be lower. And also their time horizon is generally much shorter than what we look at for the actual evaluation. So looking for some longer term, the Social Security Administration does an annual report. They do 3 projections. They do an intermediate and a high and a low.
So now we're on page 12, right?
And I'm now moved to page 12. Thank you, Andy. At the top of page 12, the Social Security projection for many, many years, their intermediate was at 2.6%. Just this year, it went to 2.4%. And then their alternatives are 1.8 and 3. And then we also look at this statistical measure where you can look at the yield on treasury bonds that are inflation indexed and those that are not. And based on those different yields, you can get a market indication of long-term inflation. Heavily market influence. It's incredibly low at about 1.4%. So there is no formula we use for this. It's somewhat subjective. This is also an assumption that Siegel's California practice. We have a consistent inflation assumption that we recommend for all of our systems at any point in time. And this is now the 3rd year that we've been recommending the 2.75. We tend to move fairly slow on this assumption. We tend to really want to make sure that we think there's a sort of a permanent change in future expectations. But we have I'd say a very strong recommendation to go to the 2.75. When we have our actual evaluations audited by other actuarial firms, they all indicate that moving below 3% is strongly indicated. And some even say that eventually we may be looking at 2.5%. This is another feature of Siegel's consulting. We tend to try to make small changes. We also don't want to fine tune this too much. We really don't work in increments of 1/10. We tend to make these economic assumption changes in 1/4 point increments. So we're recommending basically 1 click on the dial, reducing the inflation from 3% to 2.75. Again, I'm still on page 10. This is a fairly important assumption because this is what ultimately drives not only the change in the expected return, but also, as we just discussed, a change in the increase in the future average wages. It also has consequences on retiree cost of living. You know, you do have a a 3%. You have tiers where the maximum COLA is 3%. But we have always basically used the inflation assumption to predict the COLAs. And so now we will be predicting that on the average, the members that are in these 3% tiers will get on the average 2.75. However, any members who have a COLA bank, in our valuation, we do assume that the COLA bank will be used up. When we assume 2.75 going forward, we assume members will receive the 3% until their COLA bank is exhausted. That's part of our actuarial valuation. Andy, would you please check me on that to make sure I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also get this question from time to time, which is, so when SACRS recommend a lower cost of living adjustment assumption of 2.75, does that really impact how much retirees will receive? So for example, if the West Region CPI were to come in maybe higher, 3%, are you going to force the board to only approve a 2.75% because that's our assumption? And of course, the answer is absolutely not. This is just to project what the cost will be. It has nothing to do with what members will get based on the board's approved index to reward the retirees, those retirees who are otherwise eligible for up to a 3% COLA.
This is one of the reasons, though, when we looked at the cost impact of the economic assumptions in total, this is the reason that it comes out fairly even. It's because, we're going to get to in a moment where we're going to lower the expected return recommended from 7 to 6.75. That would tend to increase the cost. But when you lower the cost of the inflation assumption, it does two things. It lowers the assumed, not actual, but assumed retiree COLA, and it also lowers salary increases. And those two together, lower assumption for retiree COLAs and lower assumption for salary increases, those two combine to offset the effect of the lower discount rate. And that's why we saw a fairly small cost increase for the economic assumptions, because the change in COLA it increases costs for actives and retireds from the discount rate, but it decreases costs for actives and retireds, actives because of salaries and retirees because of lower assumed COLAs. That's why the two cancel out. And again, I'm still here on page 12.
Paul, this is Quincy. I do have a question regarding the COLA.
Mm-hmm.
I know historically, I have not been on the board as long as some of the other members, but we have continually and regularly voted on a 3% COLA, even in years where we have, quote, banked above 3%. So we've carried that over to later years. And I understand, I believe your statement that even if we assume a 2.75, that we can continue to give a 3% if that's the board's direction in future years, as long as there's a bank to pull from. But is it safe to make that assumption that moving forward that we wouldn't be able to sustain that 3% in future years if we move that down? Or am I misinterpreting your presentation?
Andy will check me on this, but we actually, in our valuation, we know for each member what their COLA bank is. Andy, is that correct?
That's right.
And so we actually, for each member, we assume that they will receive the 3% until that individual member's bank is exhausted. And then from then on, we assume that they will get the 2.75. So we take that exactly into account for each member in the valuation. Again, that does not affect the benefit they actually get, but that's how we anticipate that in the valuation. Does that address your question?
I believe it does. So as long as the amount they've contributed individually remains in the bank, then they will continue to get to 3% until that's exhausted.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Okay. I do understand.
The only time the COLA bank would be made higher if, for example, if there were some unusual price increases, consumer price index, CPI went up much higher than 3%, for example, 4%, then retirees would see 1% added to the bank. Otherwise, if these lower inflation environment, such as what we are predicting for the long term will happen, then there will be a continued drawdown of the bank. So which means that the board won't be able to give them a 3% COLA because CPI is lower and they don't have anything in the bank. So those retirees would now have to receive a lower COLA for those years in the future.
Okay.
And I'll comment just a point of terminology. We would not say that the members contributed to the COLA bank. The COLA bank occurs because you had years of inflation that were higher than the 3%, and that's what goes into it. So it's really the economy, inflation, if you will, contributes to the bank and then gets drawn down in years of lower inflation.
It would be the carryover where we gave them potentially 3%, but it could have been higher. We didn't. We banked that.
Well, and you didn't because the plan that you have adopted has a maximum COLA of 3%.
Yeah.
So, right, Andy, you can never actually grant a COLA higher than 3. If actual inflation is higher, that's what goes into the bank.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question. Earlier, we were discussing the CPI, the inflation rate for the country, if not the world. And in the COLA, it's based on a regional CPI, which historically has been higher than the national CPI. So is there a requirement that just because the plan assumes a long-term CPI for the nation to be 2.75, that we must assume that the regional CPI is also 2.75, or can those two numbers be independent of each other?
I think they could be independent of each other. You can make the same comment about inflation as a component of salary. We have never seen that done. And I think, again, the reason is I keep falling back on the actuarial blanket of the long-term assumption. We do not know of any analysis that would establish that local price inflation and national price inflation are going to be different over the long term. And I think even historically, I think it has gone back and forth. Andy, you can check me on this, but there have been times when national CPI is higher than local, and other times when it's lower than local. Right. But in the long term, though, we don't see a way of concluding that it would be, what's the right term, economically stable or viable for California or an area of California to permanently have inflation that's different from the national economy.
Well, I don't know that that's true. Housing is a large component of the CPI, and housing costs have gone up over the last several decades much faster in California, and they're much higher in California than they are in the nation as a whole. So I'm not so sure that the COLA, if you look at the last 30 years, the CPI wasn't higher in the Western region than it was, which is dominated by California because it's weighted by population. I would be doubtful that the Western region grew at a slower rate or the same rate as the national CPI.
Andy, do you have any comment on that?
That I have to admit we have not looked at. We have really not looked at, especially in the short term. What's the deviance between the California, between the index that, for example, the county has to use to determine salary increases for its employees, the index for the Western region, which the board used to provide COLA for our retirees, and then the national index, which we use, inflation index, which we use to set the long-term investment return assumption. I think we have not looked at those three and see how much they have either converged or diverged over an extended period of time.
And I think part of this, though, also, Mr. Sturdy, goes into, I guess I'll call it the actuarial humility. I mean, when we were talking about the price inflation, the 2.75, I mean, this is a fundamentally imprecise number. Again, you have market indicators down at 1.4, you have Social Security at 2.6, and so we think there's a certain amount of humility in setting any long-term price inflation, and the idea that we would be able to reliably also predict long-term variation between local and national, I just think it goes beyond the precision of our model.
You could see on television a really nice home in Texas for under $200,000. You can't buy a shack for that in California or in Mendocino County.
Well, but there again, it says two things. One is, to what extent, if we're using CPI to reflect retiree cost of living or to reflect salary increases, to what extent does the level of housing, remember, I want to distinguish between the level of housing and the change in housing prices. So the fact that real estate is cheaper elsewhere doesn't necessarily mean that the long-term changes in those prices will be different elsewhere. So that's one distinction. And the other is that different elements of the inflation basket are going to affect different parts of your membership differently. And it may be that housing, whether it's the level of housing prices or the growth in housing prices, may not be an appropriate measure for evaluating COLAs, because it's all about purchasing power for the retiree.
And Paul, if I could, this is Tim Knudsen just for a minute.
Yes, Tim.
To get back to Quincy's comment about the COLA bank, I look back at our last letter from you on the COLA, and only people who retired prior to April 2nd, 1983 have a COLA bank. So it's not really a big issue, I don't think, at this point.
Right. Andy, that's consistent with our data, of course, right?
Yeah, I think it's only for some of our other clients, definitely not at Mendocino, where they have a 2% COLA adjustment. It's more important for those clients, but Tim, you're right that because we have a 3% COLA, we do tend to see Mendocino and those other clients with a 3% COLA to have retired with a much lower COLA bank. And as you indicated, you would have to have retired for 40 years ago before you could have a COLA bank.
Any other questions on the COLA or price inflation? We're going to move now next to the rate of return. Okay, hearing none, I'm going now. I'm rolling through page 13 and on to page 14. And we use what is called a building block approach or a component approach. The two principal components are price inflation and real rates of return. The terminology is your current assumption of 7% is called the nominal return, and that's composed of price inflation and then returns above inflation, which are called the real return. And then when we do that real return, even that has a couple of components. It has sort of the market indicators from a survey that we do. It has an adjustment for expenses, and then it has an adjustment for risk, what we call a risk adjustment. So let's start with the real rate of return. So what we do is we take for each client, we take the actual, and again, I'm now still on page 14, the table in the middle of page 14, we take the actual investment and the asset allocation for each plan. You see this in the first column where it says asset class, and here's the percentage. And then we publish what your investment consultant's capital market assumptions are, but we want to be very clear, this is purely an informational number. They are simply one voice in the survey. As you can see down here in these footnotes, that we do a survey of Callan and 6 other investment firms, a total of 7 firms. But Callan has no more or less weight than any others because we're really trying to get more of a consensus opinion on capital market assumptions that is not dependent on who you happen to hire. We'll say this later in the report, but the idea is if you were to change investment consultants, which we're not, of course, not recommending at all, but if you did, we don't believe that should affect how you value your pension liabilities, because your investment consultant's job is to work on asset allocation. So we don't want to give any individual investment consultant, including your own, an outsized weight when trying to develop a measure of your liabilities. So here we see the average of these for these 7 firms for these 6 asset classes. And so if we just do the math, take the percentage of the portfolio times the return for that asset class and add them all up, and you get 4.87%. So that is the real return component based on your asset allocation and a current survey of investment consultants working for public plans in California. So then we take that number. Now I'm going to page 15. And there's some comments on this. We are using only indexed returns. We do not assume any what's sometimes called alpha. that the investment managers are going to do better than the indexes. That is consistent with the actuarial standard of practice, which says you can only include alpha if you can basically prove it. And we have not seen studies that show that alpha delivers long term. Then some other comments here. Here's where we mentioned that the reason that we use a survey is to get a broader range of capital market information. It's also to sort of help reduce volatility from one study to the next. Now, it's interesting to note that when we did this very same study 3 years ago, that we got a number that was within 1 basis point of the current 4.87. So when we did it 3 years ago, it was 4.88. We'll see this on a little chart later on. So really, it's just a status quo. There's been very little change in asset allocation and very little change in the capital market assumptions. So really, this real rate of return was essentially unchanged from 2 years ago. You can kind of see where this is going. If the real rate of return is unchanged, and if the inflation component has come down 25 basis points, well, then the nominal return is going to come down in 25 basis points. That's this whole section in a nutshell. So let me move ahead now to page 16. We look at the association expenses. We look at both investment expenses and administrative expenses. Again, very, very flat. We looked not just the 3 years, but the 3 years before that. And the current assumption for administrative expenses is 15 basis points. That's consistent with the 6-year average. The current assumption for investment expenses, 25 basis points, again, consistent with both the 6 and the 3-year averages. So there's really nothing here to indicate a change in the current component of 40 basis points. So again, a status quo result compared to 3 years ago. Okay, then the last part, let's see here, the risk adjustment. Now this gets a little, very much into Siegel's actuarial model. Every consulting firm has a way of saying, well, if we just use the expected return and the expected expenses and expected inflation, that would give me an expected, expected real return. If we use the expected real return and inflation and expenses, that would give us an expected nominal return. But we'd like to be right more often than not. And so we do a statistical adjustment, and it's all described here in detail. We do a statistical adjustment where we actually move below that expected return and then translate that into, well, if the expected return, if we call that a 50% confidence, and we then adopt assumptions somewhat lower than that, how much does that increase our confidence of hitting that number? And we use a 15-year for this statistical measure. I'm going to go to the table that summarizes all this. I think it's easier to understand the text. So I'm now going through page 17. I'm now on page 18. 18 just shows the history of this confidence level. You have historically been in the mid to low 50s. In your 2017 study, we'll show this in a table in a moment, that confidence level went up to 55. And because really nothing has changed here except for the price inflation, that confidence level would remain stable at 55. So I'm going to jump to a table which we have on page 19 that really summarizes everything we've said in this section. 3 years ago, we had price inflation at 3%. We had the real return from the survey based on your asset allocation of 4.88. We had expenses of 40, that was 15 administrative and 25 investment. And then we quite literally back into the risk adjustment. That is, if we assume, based on your 7% assumption, it means you had a 48-point risk adjustment, which increases your confidence level from 50 to 55. You can see it's very much a status quo. It's all driven by the lower price inflation at 2.75, real return essentially unchanged, expenses essentially unchanged, risk adjustment essentially unchanged. So now we have the new recommendation of nominal return of 6.75 and a consistent confidence level of 55%. Now we look at this a couple other ways. We run an alternative model that's more of a stochastic, probabilistic kind of approach, where this is a little more deterministic. We also compare to other systems. Let me look at those just quickly here, and then we'll come back to this table for any discussion. I'm still on page 19. We actually ran there are a couple consulting firms working in California that use a different model than Siegel's. And we did this what they tend to do is use a different measure of expected return. It's called a forward-looking expected geometric as opposed to forward-looking expected arithmetic. Those are both perfectly acceptable under the standards of practice, but they also tend not to deduct for investment expenses, whereas we deducted 25 points for investment expenses. So we ran their model, and if we do that, we actually get a 56% likelihood. This is something of a coincidence, but these are two different models coming up with a comparable, what is called a confidence level. So that's just a little bit of an external verification. Finally, I want to look now on page 20. I now want to look at comparison with other retirement systems. We noticed that in California, 7% or lower is becoming more common. However, we also noticed that in at least among the 37 Act systems, they are mostly at 7% or at 7.25, and the 7.25s are, a lot of them are still under review. There is already one system, Sacramento adopted 6.75, and San Mateo County has a 6.5% expected return. The remaining 6 use 7.25. CalPERS is at 7%, but they're reviewing that, whereas San Diego and San Jose are at 6.75 and 6.5. So it's not that we make this decision based upon what others do, but it does mean that by going to 6.75, Mendocino would be slightly ahead of the curve. We think that's primarily because you have a fairly conservative asset allocation, perhaps compared to some of your sister systems. Nationally, this is this NASRA database. Nationally, the systems tend to lag California. There, the median is 7.25. That has dropped dramatically the last couple of years, but we think we're going to continue to see further motion. But it's again, it's always been the case that California has been ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the country in terms of maintaining and updating their expected returns. So in summary here, again, I'm still on page 20. We think that our risk adjustment model and all these other considerations clearly indicate our recommendation of 6.75. I'm going to scroll back up to page 19, the table on page 19 that shows the current recommendation compared to the one from 3 years ago. At this point, Madam Chair, I'd pause for questions and discussions on the recommended reduction in the expected return.
Are there any questions or comments?
I'll just ask this. It's a question I asked a few years ago. So you've shown the likelihood of achieving the expected returns at 55%. What would the assumed investment return be if you wanted to have a 66% or a 2 out of 3 odds of achieving it?
Well, Andy, I always wonder how linear this is. 50 basis points gets you 5% of confidence. Mm-hmm. Okay. So if instead of, if we wanted to have from 55 to 66, that would be, let's go from 55 to 65, just for round numbers. That'd be another 10 points of confidence. I don't think that this is quite linear, but rough justice, it would be another 100 basis points. So you'd be down at 5.75. And I always want to stress, you know, the reason we had a trustee once asked, well, why don't we go to a 95% confidence? Okay, I mean, you know, because a lot of times when you want to be sure of something, statisticians will say 95% confidence. Well, remember, if there's a 95 or 66, if there's a 66% chance that you're going to earn more than the assumed rate, that means there's a 66% chance that you are overcharging the current taxpayer. So remember, there's a trade-off here, and having a higher confidence level, you can call it a form of insurance, but if you load up on that insurance, it means that you're going to be charging your employers and your members higher costs. And so that's one reason why we don't go to a 95% confidence or even a 65% or 66% confidence, because we're trying to neither overcharge nor undercharge the current taxpayers compared to future taxpayers. We just want to have a little bit of safety, leaning that we'd rather have a risk of costs going down in the future compared to up, but we don't want there to be a 2/3 chance that this is general practice, 2/3 chance that costs will go down in the future, because it means there's a 2/3 chance that we are now front loading the contribution. And now, Andy, you have to tell me, I don't think this is linear, so I can't really say with confidence, Mr. Jurdy, that it was, what did I say, 100 basis points down to 5.75? Andy, how wrong am I on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Because in order to increase the level of confidence, the farther you get away from the 50-50, the larger or the bigger reduction in the interest rate would have to be. So it's definitely not linear.
So it could be even more than 100 basis points,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
I understand what you said.
Right.
Okay. So I would say at least, it would have to go down at least to 5.75 and perhaps lower to get a 2/3 confidence. It's very rough justice though. So.
Well, I guess my point is, if the fund was at balance or close to it, then the 55% would seem more reasonable. But it does seem like a higher confidence level would be the reasonable course when the fund is not nearly balanced.
And now, by the way, this, I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is the great policy paradox of this decision. When you say the fund's out of balance, I assume you mean that the funded ratio is less than 100%. Andy, can you tell me quickly what the funded ratio is for Mendocino?
It's about 70%.
About 70. Okay. Here's the thing. This is the classic case of no good deed goes unpunished. I hope we all understand. We showed you that if you lower this discount rate and make these other assumption changes, that it actually will increase the cost of the plan, even though for the economics, relatively break even. If you lower the discount rate further, remember what that will do is increase the liability and therefore lower your funded ratio. So ironically, an action that you might think might be indicated because the plan's underfunded will actually make the plan look even more underfunded. So it's hard to solve underfunding by lowering the discount rate, because then that actually makes the plan look even more underfunded. And the other thing is, I've had this discussion in other actuarial circles, the idea of should you be more conservative because the plan's underfunded. I'm not entirely sure, and I say this with all due respect, I'm not completely sure I get the logic there, unless you have a plan that is severely underfunded, which no plans in California are. We believe that setting your assumptions using your best expectation of future experience with some reasonable margin for success here is appropriate, whether the plan is 80% funded or 70% funded or 90% funded. Because again, the underfunding, the level of underfunding is addressed in your funding policy. Your employers are funding that spread. And again, we're not sure we see the policy justification of making the plan appear even more underfunded by using a more conservative discount rate simply because the plan is not at 100%. So I would respectfully push back on whether that whether the better way to deal with the underfunding is through a robust funding policy, which you have in place. Madam Chair, any other questions or discussion on the expected return?
Can you hear me? This is Sherry.
Yes, there you go, Sherry, I hear you.
Okay, sorry. So I just have a few things to say. I feel like this recommendation is reasonable. I feel that one thing I think we really have to keep in mind is that this is looking back at a 3-year period. And I was like Supervisor Jurdy, as I'm reading this the whole time, I'm going, oh my gosh, what about all these raises that we know are down the pike? But I think that, especially with what Andy added, that we're going to be looking at that next month. It sounds like we're going to be taking another review at that, which I think is good. But it feels like when you look at this, just what has been said, what Paul said about and this is not unusual for us, we're at the head of the curve. We're going to 6.75, this recommendation, prior to a lot of other SACRS counties, and that seems to be how we proceed. We always seem like we're at the front of this. And it just feels like, to me, just with everything, to me, it's about life is a balanced approach. And I feel really comfortable with this presentation and this recommendation that at this time, based on these 3 years, that this is exactly where we need to be right now. Now, when we talk next month with and start talking about other things, that's a different case. But I think at this point, with what we're looking at right now, I completely support this recommendation. And thank you.
Yeah, and let me just observe in the next section coming right up, we are going to look at salaries, and we are recommending higher merit and promotion increases. So we are also going to be moving to more conservative salary assumptions. We haven't gone through that in detail, but you saw that in the summary of cost. It was about a 2 1/3% of pay. Was that Andy? Did I get it right? To about 2 1/3% of pay cost increase from the other assumptions, and half of that was because of the salary. So we are actually going to be moving to more conservative salary assumptions. It's just not in these components. It'll show up in the next few pages. And that's where the experience of the last 3 years and the last 6 years, you'll see that bright line right on the page. Madam Chair, any other questions? I know you can't look around and see anybody, but maybe you've got I have the little panel group here. I can't see everybody at once. Any other questions? Ms. Cadmus?
Yes, I don't have any other questions. Does anyone else have any other questions? I can't see all of you at once, so raise your voice if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I think
we will continue. So I'm going to keep going for the salary part, and I'm going to hand this over to Andy when we because he also has some stuff to comment on the salary, and then we'll let Andy go through and talk about mortality and such. So I'm now scrolling down through past page 20. Now I'm on page 21 where it says salary increase. So we already talked about price inflation. And so that component of salaries is going down by 25 basis points. That's right there on item 1. Now we also make an assumption on, and this is a macroeconomic assumption. It's not based on your data specifically, just like the price inflation was not based on your data specifically. You know, that average wages historically grow faster than average prices. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a cost index. Let me do one more thing here. Let's see here. I got to do the stop video thing, otherwise I'll scare the children away. So we use this. It's a national statistic. Again, I'm still here on page 21. And their current, this used to be quite a bit higher, but their current estimate is that real across the board pay increases have averaged from 40 to 70 basis points, 0.4 to 0.7 during the last 10 to 20 years. Social Security actually has a larger index for this. And so then because this is macroeconomic, we look a little bit at your recent experience, and it does show that average salaries over the last 3 years have increased faster than average prices. But here, I think you can see this is exactly what we've been talking about. The last 2 years have seen average increases quite a bit greater. But again, this is very, very possibly because of short-term adjustments in salary. So you boil all this together, and we believe that our current assumption of 50 basis points of real wage growth continues to be appropriate. So now I'm on page 22. So we will recommend continuing that. And that's how we get to the combined increase in average wages. That's inflation plus across the board real wage growth will go from 3.5 down to 3.25. But again, this is still a macroeconomic assumption. Now, for merit and promotion, this part gets a little tricky because what we want to try to do, we are given for the study, we know each continuing member's salary during the 3 years of the study. So we can calculate for each member what is their increase in salary for each continuing member. And then we can calculate the average increase in salary. Now this gets the words a little tricky here. So we take the average salary increase, and then we look at, for the population in total, for the active membership in total, what is the average salary and how much does the average salary of the entire group change? Now that is going to be lower. That each year you have folks at the end of their careers retiring at higher salaries, being replaced by folks coming in entry age at lower salaries. So what that means is the increase in the average salary will be less than the average salary increase member by member. Those sound like the same words, but we actually do that. We calculate for each member how much the salary increased. We average those. We call that the average salary increase. And then we look at the average salary for the whole group, and we compare those over the 3 years, and we call that the increase in the average salary. And the spread between those is what we call the merit and promotion. What I just said is described in detail right here with these this A through F, still on page 22. Then what we notice is, now Andy checked me on this, at the bottom of page 22, that increase in the average salary, and what we saw there was it was either 4.27% or 0.89%, depending on which period of time we look at. Andy, would you check me on that, please?
Yeah. So if we look at the most recent 3 years, it would be the much higher 4.27%. But if we look at the longer period, then it would be only coming in about 0.89%.
And that 0.89, is that for a 6-year period, or is that the previous 3-year period?
It would be the previous 3-year period.
Previous 3-year period, okay. And we kind of see that. I'm going back now to page 21. We only have the last 3 years here, but you can see for 2017 is much lower. Andy, what I think you're telling me is if we had this for the previous 3 years, we would see numbers more comparable to 1.84 than the 5.35 here at the bottom of page 21.
That's right. Because as Trustee Jeremy has indicated early on, the recent MOUs have only shown up, at least in our data, since the June 30, 2018 valuation. So I think maybe this is a good segue before we show the point recommendation. I think as part of the June 30, 2018 valuation, we saw, say, for the first time in many years that our members are, say, finally getting salary increases. So we want to be extra sure that those are indeed salary increases that are showing up on the data. So I think we reach out to staff and, for example, get the MOUs for the SEIU group, and we saw got proof that salary increases were provided, and those salary increases were based on years of service, and it goes all the way up to 10, 15, and 20 years. And even after members with 20 years of service are getting promotional increases, again, for the first time in many years, which equals 1%. So that tie into the recommendations that we will see on the next page.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So now I'm going to go back. I'm now going through page 22, and now I'm going to page 23. Now, some folks like tables and some folks like graphs. I tend to look at the graphs. What we've done here, so I'm just going to talk here on page 23 just for a moment on this table, then we'll look at the graph that follows. We show here the current assumptions. Now remember, this is wage increases above the averages. So it's under the current assumptions, it's 3.5% plus what we see here. And we have found that service is the best predictor of increases in salaries above the averages. So we look here at the current 3-year period, and then we looked at the prior 3-year period. Now I want to, sometimes we'll do 3 years and 6 years, but here we actually kept the 2 3-year periods separate. And we really can see the effect of these adjustments that we saw in the last 2 lines of that table above. And then this is where actuarial art meets actuarial science. We basically take a blending of the current assumption and the recent experience. I find it easier to see how that works in a graph. So I'm now going to scroll down. By that, this was for general members here at the top of page 23. At the bottom of page 23, we see the same analysis for the safety and probation members with the same analysis. Now here though, remember we were talking about what the increase in the average wage was, and up here for general, it was those 2 numbers that we mentioned, the 4.27 and the 0.89. Here for safety, they were somewhat larger. That is in the most recent period, it was 4.68. And in the period before that, it was 2.55. And so that we back out of the increase, the average increase in salaries, and what remains is what we call this merit and promotion. All right, so let's go, I'm now going to scroll through, I'm going to jump over a couple pages because I want to get to these graphs. So I'm now going to page 25. At the top of page 25, we see the graph for the general members. And by the way, there are a whole lot of these kind of graphs. When we get to Andy's section on demographics, you'll see this over and over. The red diamonds is always the current assumption. Okay? The green squares is the actual experience from the current study. And then the blue triangles is the recommended assumption. Now, the only thing that's different here, in addition to the green squares, you also have light green circles. That's because we have tried to include both the current study and the prior study. And so what you can see here is, and Andy, just check me for a second. I just want to make sure we got the order here right, because this is showing that the prior study is when we had the higher merit and promotion increases, because again, these are the increases above the increases in average.
That's right.
Okay. So you can see what we're doing here is, if we used the prior study, we would have had, much higher actual, but now things have stabilized somewhat. So in the current study, we have these, the green squares. And again, it's something of a judgment of how much do we weight the recent experience against the historical experience, which is reflected in the current assumption of the red line. But anyway, this just shows the same thing that was on the table. And it does mean that for members with over 10 years, we've gone from, I think it looks like about 50 basis points to 100 basis points. I'm going to scroll back up to the table on page 23, where we can see that at the top of page 23, you can see the ultimate, the 10 and over used to be 50 basis points, and now it's a full percent or 100 basis points. And then we're going to see the same thing essentially happens for safety. We'll see that. Now, I'm sorry to make you all dizzy. Now I'm going to go back down to the page with the graphs on it, which is page 25. Here's the general. Now I'm going to the bottom of that page to see for safety. Now safety, we don't, there are fewer safety members. And so the data tends to be a lot noisier. So imagine you're Andy and all you have on the page first is the red diamonds. That's the current assumption. And the next thing, all you have is the green squares, the heavy green squares. Well, that's a pretty crazy roller coaster ride. That's just because of the amount of data that we have. You're not going to get a nice smooth curve. Real data is always bumpy. And so then with that in front of us and also the results from the, oops, I shouldn't do that. And also the results from the previous 3 years. Here's again where judgment comes in, and Andy and his staff developed the blue line, the blue triangles, which is our recommended assumption. And again, a balance between the current assumption in the red diamonds and the recent experience in the green squares. So really our message here is, even though we are lowering average wage growth by 25 basis points, we're substantially increasing the total salary growth because we're increasing this merit and promotion component. So net, we are not assuming lower salary growth going forward. In fact, just the opposite, we're assuming higher salaries. And that's why we saw, maybe about a little over 1% in terms of cost increase just for this recommended salary change. I believe that is it for my portion. So we've had a lot of discussion of salaries. I'll pause if there are any questions from the trustees. I'm going to stick here on page 25 that has the general and the salary, the graphs. But I'll pause for any questions from the trustees about this. And then absent that, I will hand the presentation over to Andy to take us through the demographic assumptions.
Does anyone need a bio break or are we okay?
Madam Chair, I actually had a question regarding some of the salary and adjustments there.
Okay.
Paul, this is Quincy again. I understand your presentation regarding that, but I don't think the majority of the bargaining units market adjustments are going to be included on any of these numbers because there was only a few of the bargaining units that entered into a contract to go in before June of 2019. And if my memory serves me correct, the first year of most people's 3-year contracts that included the market adjustments didn't begin until July of 19. So we would be entering into the second year of those market adjustments in July of 20. So I don't think it's actually included on any of these numbers.
Okay. In that case, again, it will show up in the actual experience and the evaluations. Then when we do the next 3-year study, I think we're going to need to be a little bit careful. And this is why Andy says he always talks to the staff to find out if there's anything extraordinary in here. We need to be careful that if it is an extraordinary increase, well, if it really applies to everybody, and this is how our model is supposed to work. If it applies to everybody, that will show up in the increase in the average salary. And that's the thing that we subtract out. So the model should be able to adjust for that, because if everybody gets it, it'll be in the average increase in the average salaries, which gets subtracted from the individual salary increases. So it should still leave in the green lines here only people who are moving ahead of the averages. And so that should filter out these across the board salary adjustments. But I think, Andy, we'll just need to be sure to watch for that when we do the study in 3 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I understand that. I just wanted to bring from what my recollection is, that I don't think those numbers, even the first year, are included yet in there.
Okay.
And some of them are, I think across the board, they are going to be a higher than average adjustments for the majority of all members. Some are upwards of 30 to 40% of increase over 3 years, and some are obviously lower than that. So there isn't a hard number for any of those combined. There may be an average number, but I just wanted to, from my recollection of the negotiations, I wanted to make sure everybody understood from my stance and my memory that I don't think any of those years are actually included on these.
Very good. Thank you.
And I'll just add in that I think that what you're seeing in the contracts is a change in philosophy from having a large number of employees who are underpaid to a slightly smaller or a smaller workforce that is sufficiently paid. And so, that it's just a change in philosophy that the county's going in. And so, we have to have a balanced budget. We're not the federal government. We can't print money. So we have to balance the budget, and it's either going to come in revenue increases, which is largely not the case in this county, or it's coming from cutting other expenses. So you can cut expenses in 2 ways: operational expenses. And operational expenses are largely employee expenses, and they're also non-employee expenses. So the county is doing what it can to cut non-employees expenses as much as possible. That's office buildings, related expenses, and then it's salaries. So the number of employees, if we have a hiring freeze that's been in effect for over a year now, flexible hiring freeze. So each position as it becomes vacant gets evaluated to see whether it'll be filled or not. And it's hoped that through attrition, that enough positions are left vacant and departments are reorganized, positions are consolidated, so the county can afford to adequately pay the employees.
Madam Chair, any other questions on this section?
Seeing none, we could proceed.
Okay. So, Andy, I can continue to do the pages for. Do you want to take control of the document?
Yeah, I'll try to. I think we'll go through some of the assumptions that we have only provide minor adjustments, and I'll use retirement rates. I'm going to go to the table, if you would please, Paul, to page 27. So this is one assumption where the experience from the most recent 3 years did not ask for or required a lot of adjustments. So for example, we look at the retirement rates for each and every membership category: general, safety, and probation. In this case, in order to get more data, the retirement experience for general tiers 1, 2, and 3 have all been combined together. So we take a look at what the current assumption is. So for example, starting at age 50, if we have 100 employees at age 50, which of course we may not have, we then assume that in a single year, 6 of them would have retired. So that's how the current 6% rate would have been applied. But when we look at the actual data, it's about 9.66. So the reason why we deal with the fractional year is because you just take the number of folks divided by the people who would be at that age, and the number is about 9, call it 10 employees. Now, in this case, what we do in order to set the assumptions, again, this is going back to the point that Paul made, is a lot of art as well as science in coming up with this number. So in this case, we come up with 5. And the reason why we do not try to chase the actual experience of 9 is because if you look at the rates right beneath that at age 51, we make the same assumption that the probability of retirement would be 6, but only about 2.5 or 3 employees retire at that age. So rather than to increase the rate at age 50 and only to decrease at age 51, we try to strike the balance between those 2 rates. Now, this might be the place where, like Paul indicated, it might be easier to look at the graph. So I would ask you to please turn to page 31. And so the way the rates are set up is very similar to what Paul has gone through on the salary increase. So we always have a red diamond, and that's the current rate. We have the actual experience. In this case, we have only looked at the actual experience from the last 3 years, and that's the green square. And last but not least, we have the blue diamond the triangle, which is the proposed experience. So you won't be able to see that very clearly in the initial years, but if you take a look at how we come with the proposed rate, we almost try to come with a proposed rate so that the proposed rate will be somewhere in between and split the difference between the current and the actual experience. Now that's the case until, for example, you reach, let's say, age 67 or 66 or 67, where because there was really not that much data at those higher retirement ages, the number of retirements actually spiked up to almost 70% at age 67. So rather than to chase that actual experience, we decided to make no change, only because at those very advanced age, there were very few of our employees left, general employees left, who have not yet retired as of age 67. But really,
I like to think like this one here at 66, looks like it's about 66%. That could be that there were 3 people and 2 of them retired. So again, very limited data gives you a very bumpy experience.
That's right. And I think to illustrate that very bumpy experience, all we have to do is to look at the following page, where our safety group is has a smaller workforce than the general, and so the data is the actual experience even noisier. And of course, last but not least, we have even fewest probation members on the bottom of page 32, where because there's just so few data, so even though if we look at the bottom of page 32 for the probation group, I think this is the one where we must have just one retiree, one employee at age 55, that person retired, and so that's why it's 100%. So rather than to, again, chase that experience, we try to strike the balance, split the difference between the current assumptions and the actual experience. So that's how we set the rate. Again, pleased to report that very little difference between the current assumptions and the actual experience. So for that reason, very little cost ramification, because we did not see the need to make a big adjustments to those rates. Now that's the case for, I think I'm going to skip over the termination, disability, and so on, but I'm going to now ask you to look at the mortality experience. So the mortality experience started at page 34, because as Paul has indicated in his introductory remarks, a few things have happened with the current experience study, because for the first time, we now have a good, solid public sector experience. The Society of Actuaries have come up with the so-called public 2010 mortality tables. So there are really 3 sets of mortality tables that are provided. First, they have provided the teachers' mortality table, which of course do not apply to us because our plan do not cover any teachers. And then we have the tables provided for the general members. We have tables provided for safety members. And there are also tables that are provided for the retirees after those individuals retire. Now, in terms of rank, I think if I remember correctly, when the table was published, it was concluded that the teachers lived a very long life, and that's they have the longest life expectancy, followed by the general members, safety, even though there's not much of a difference, very little difference between the general and the safety tables. So that's one major change that happened this year. For the first time, again, we have been provided with public sector table. Now, as we have indicated to you in the past, we don't just take a set of table published by the Society of Actuaries and turn around and recommend those to you. We actually try to customize the experience of MSARA in trying to come up with a mortality table. However, in this case, starting for this year, we also paid much more attention to the so-called creditability theory. So the theory is that, well, for a group our size, especially when we go to the safety, we just don't have enough data. So for that reason, even though when we try to make the adjustment that we would have recommend to the board would be very small. Now, we do have a little more data from the general, so that's why when we go through the exercise, we do make a little bit more adjustment for the general. So this would be change number 2. Besides the public sector table, we continue to adjust these published table to reflect the experience at MSARA, but we try not to make as much adjustment as we have in the past based on this creditability theory. We also talk about, Paul talked about the application of the generational mortality table. The long and short is, in the past, when we have to determine how long a member is expected to live after retirement, all we have to ask the computer is, well, what is the age of the person as of the day when you ask that question? So, however, so that's the static table. Now, going forward, when we ask the question, when we try to determine how long a member is going to live, and when you tell me that, oh, we are asking the question for someone at age 55, now I'm going to have to ask you another question, which is that retiree reaching age 55 today, or is that retiree reaching 55 1 year from now, 2 years from now, or 3 years from now? Because with the generational mortality table, each and every generation of 55-year-old is expected to live longer in the future. So it is something that is kind of built into the mortality table, as opposed to in the past, when we set the life expectancy, the cost for the program, we always have to make some minor adjustments going forward, because every year when we see that retirees are living longer, then we have to go in and basically ratchet up the cost factor a little bit. So with the generational mortality table, at least the hope and the theory is that we don't have to do that constantly and almost periodically every 3 years. Now, I think last but not least, something that is also important is in the past, when we determine how many people are expected to live at each and every age, again, all we have to do is to look at the age of the individual, and that's the only thing that matters. However, when the Society of Actuaries published these new mortality tables, now they have also looked at how likely or unlikely are the level of retirement income, the pension that those retirees are going to receive, how is that going to play into the part of how long that he or she is expected to live. So it is at the bottom of page 34. So I think there's a table, Paul, you can scroll down a little bit for me if you would, where there are studies that have been done which basically back up the theory that if a retiree has a high level of income, then that retiree is going to live longer than somebody retiring at that same age but with a lower level of income. So we have introduced as part of this analysis the so-called benefit weighted mortality table. So on this page, we have the average benefits that are received, for example, for the male retiree. So if you earn income in excess of, say, $21,000, based on the study that was done in 2010, for the general, then you are considered to be receiving a benefit which is above the median. And the level of income is lower for the female because it's only about $11,900. So when we look at the data for Mendocino and we try to compare that to the Society of Actuaries experience, I have to admit that when I look at the data, initially I was thinking that, well, maybe our retirees, because our salaries, like some of the trustees have already indicated, used to be lower than the rest of the counties. So I would have expected our retirees to be receiving incomes which are lower. But to my surprise, good for the members, that our retirees are actually receiving income which are slightly above these amounts. And the reason why that is the case is we have a more predominantly female workforce among the general population. So even though our average retirement income is less than $2,000 among the general, but once you weighted that between the male and the female, we are considered, at least by the Society of Actuaries in the tables, as an above median group. So we also take that into account in coming up with the mortality experience. So now if we maybe skip over to page 37, I think we can actually take a look and see how our experience compares. So when we look at the mortality experience in the past, all we do is to compare in the past anyway, how many members are expected to die and how many members actually die, and what the new mortality table would bring. But in this case, starting with this year, instead of just looking at the number of retirees, we actually apply the number of retirees to their income, and that's what you get by looking at for example, the male. So if we look over the period of, in this case, a period of 8 years, take a look at how many retirees are expected to die, but apply those on a weighted average basis by the income. The amount was about $1.59 million, but in actuality, 1.64 actually did die, and under the new mortality table, we would have expected 1.76 million dollars. So there's a there's a table, as you can see on this page, that we go through the exercise for the general. We have continued to combine the safety and probation experience on the right-hand side of this table, and we make some small adjustments, like I said early on, based on this so-called creditability theory. So the long and short is behind, maybe just slightly behind the salary increase assumption, the merit increase assumption that Paul mentioned in this part of the presentation. This by far have the second most important impact on the cost of the plan as a result of switching to a generational mortality table using benefit weighted, as well as applying fewer adjustments when we make the recommendation to the mortality table. So I know that we have, yeah.
It's interesting to notice that there's really 4 things have happened here. We have the new public tables. We have, because of the credibility theory, we're tending to defer more to the standard tables. And then both generational mortality and the benefit weighting all add up here. So this really is a major overhaul of your mortality assumption. We expect it to be fairly stable going forward, but it's a lot of adjustments at once. Also, I've had a lot of trouble getting my hands around this whole idea of the benefit weighted. You know, the way to think of it is we used to put here how many people died, and now what we're really putting in is how many dollars of payments stopped. So we're actually looking at not the number of deaths, but at the number of dollars that stopped being paid. And that's why this whole table is now calibrated in dollars instead of in lives. I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you.
Yeah, I think then we don't need to go to that page, but on the following page, we do look at the things done the old way, look at number of people who die as compared to what's expected under the current as well as the proposed table. So we do have that for informational purposes because we know that this part is confusing.
It's interesting that, you might think here it's 110%, you're going overboard. But in fact, when you weight it by dollars up here, it comes in much closer to 102.
Yep. I think at this point, maybe if there are no other questions or any other section you want me to go to, like I said early on, the other changes in the assumptions are in the demographic assumptions are very minor. Paul, I guess we can go to the cost impact, even though you have gone through that at the beginning, but we can certainly go back to the cost impact. I know.
You want to do it at the end here, Andy?
Yeah. Because
I'm now jumping to page 57.
That's right.
57.
Right. So whereas we have continued to provide the same aggregate cost impact. Aggregate meaning that if we want to look at that at an association-wide basis, taking a look at the impact on all the general members and all the safety members and the probation, how much the employer would be expected to pay in totality for the plan. So this is the 2.48% cost impact, rate impact, and it's about $1.8 million. So then we have a smaller but nonetheless a significant impact on our members as well, because that turns out to be about 0.95% of pay, roughly about $692,000 per year. There's an increase in the unfunded liability. However, if we now turn to page 58, so what we have tried to do is to take that same information, but now look at that on a membership group and tier by tier basis. So that way you can see that the impact is really not uniform among all the membership classes that we serve. The impact, at least in this case, tend to be bigger for those tiers that have a bigger benefit. So that's why the tier 1 general, for example, is impacted more than the general tier 2 or 3, or for that matter, general tier 4. And likewise for tier 1 safety, the impact is bigger and not so much for general tier 3. And then we have on the bottom of this page a similar kind of breakdown, except that now it is for the employees. So again, it all depends on the level of benefits, as well as the assumption changes that were made for each of those tiers. So I think with that, that concludes at least my prepared remarks on the modality, on the demographic section of the report.
Andy, this is Tim again. Could I ask you a question on the mortality again? If you would go back to that chart, you showed the number of, not the one based on dollars, but the one based on number of deaths.
Yeah, so it would be on page 38.
Yeah. Yeah, that one. Are you saying there's could be 154 deaths in a year for us?
No, this is actually a team gathered over a period of 8 years. So for 8 years, yeah. So we went as far back as we can, and we have only been active since 2011. So that's why this is, on the one hand, this is all the data we have. But to answer your question, this is not 1 year. This is 8 years.
Tim, I can see why you asked that question.
Hey.
Yeah, I mean, through May of this year, we've had 30 retiree deaths, and so is that a total of 154 over an 8-year period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and yes.
Do you know, Tim, are those COVID related?
No.
No. I mean, I'm asking because, again, we're going to see a mortality spike from COVID-19. I just don't, obviously it hasn't shown up in this study, but we may see that in the next study.
How do you justify that statement?
Oh, only from what I hear on the radio. I mean, really, that's just in general. In general, actuaries we'll wait till the data happens. But if in fact there's going to be some increase in mortality, it will tend to hit the more senior population. This is just what I hear in the papers, and those are our retired members. That is not a specific prediction. There's any number of actuarial conferences trying to talk about what to expect, because we get asked all the time, and we're just open to the possibility that there may be some increased mortality, but it may vary whether you're in Manhattan or whether you're in Mendocino County. You may have geographical variances, all sorts of variances.
Right. Yeah, I think I was going to echo what Paul you just said, because of course we have both Mendocino and Alameda County as our client. I know Alameda County was hit pretty hard. I think they lead at least the Bay Area County. So maybe that's why we got the impression that it's going to impact our clients a lot, and in particular maybe when we were looking at Alameda, that would be what we expect to have happened, but maybe not so much in for Mendocino with Ukiah, for example. I don't think the cases are that many.
Right. So that was like a very general statement. It was not meant to be Mendocino specific at all. I want to be clear.
Yeah.
Well, and the bulk of the incidences are in people over 80 years old. So I don't think it doesn't have the impact if it were in younger people.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what this new mortality table would do. Because remember, the switch we are recommending to the board is going to be the what matters the most is the dollars of benefits, which is going to stop, which matters. Now, as the board, the trustees are aware, if you look at all the benefits for all retirees, those who have retired more recently would have received a higher benefit compared to those who are in the 80s. So that's what the beauty of this new mortality table is there to capture that. So the higher the level of benefits, it tends to be the more recent retirees, they're giving more weight in this analysis. So that will capture some of what you just said.
Are there any other questions or discussion about the actuarial report? Okay, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate this information, and I don't know if anyone, if we want to have a discussion after this about whether to make a motion for a new discount rate, or are we going to wait till our next meeting to revisit this? I don't know what the pleasure of the board is on this.
Madam Chair, I believe that the actuaries were hoping for a motion to consider adoption of these recommendations so they can move forward with their preparations, both for the risk study that's coming next month, and then also because they would be put into effect for the June 30 valuation. And correct me if I'm wrong, Andy.
No, you're right. And again, echoing what Doris you just said, we are hoping that the board can approve the assumptions today, so that way we can incorporate those assumptions when we come back with our risk report next month, so that way we know that those projections or illustrations that we'll be including in the risk report would be very reliable and something that the risk holders, like for example, the county, can rely on, at least in the budgeting process.
Okay. Well,
Andy and Paul, this is Jeff. Sorry to interrupt. So you're looking for a motion to adopt the study, is that correct?
And approve the assumptions for use in the valuation, yes.
Yes.
That's right.
And it would apply to all the assumptions. You don't necessarily have to spell them out. Unless the trustees choose to vary one, you would say you are adopting for the valuation all the assumptions recommended in the Siegel report.
is there a motion?
I'll move to
Well,
adopt.
if no one else,
Yeah.
I was going to say, if no one else wants to jump in, this is Jerry. I move that we adopt the actuarial report and also the assumptions as presented.
So,
Unless Tim wants to.
Yes, I believe this isn't an actuarial report. It's a
Experience study, excuse me.
experience study. And I'll second that.
okay, is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, could we have a roll call vote? Would Judy please conduct the roll call vote?
Yes. Ms. Schotmeyer?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Ms. Forrester?
Aye.
Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Parker? Is Mr. Parker still on our meeting?
He is. Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
Approved. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Jurdy?
No.
No. Motion is approved.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much. Both
Hey,
of you for this.
Thank you very much. So we will, are we needed for anything else on the agenda, Madam Chairman or Doris?
No, I think we are good.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be signing off. Thank you.
We'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Aye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. Is that okay with everyone, or do you need
Yes.
15? 10? Okay. We'll be back at 10:30.
Very well.
report. Is that something Robert would like to present, or is that something Doris would like to? Robert, I think that's your.
I can provide an introductory, but Robert would have to answer any specific questions about it since I'm still getting sort of up to speed with things. Actually, this is the report from Callan, correct, Robert?
Yep. Yeah.
And this is just reviews the May investment return performance. And actually, I'm going to turn this one over to you. We don't have anybody from Callan speaking today, or do we?
No, we don't. No, this is just a monthly investment update here. Many of you know what's been going on in the markets the last few months. So we've had to make a number of rebalance moves to stay within target, which we've successfully done. This report itself leaves out about $7 million in trades that were done at the beginning of June. So there's a little bit of activity that you don't see here. You'll see that next month. But including those trades, as far as I can tell today, we're within target ranges on every asset class. Our fixed income specifically is at 21.808% with the target at 22. Our U.S. equities at 38.56 with a target at 38. Our non-U.S. equity is sitting at 28.8% with a target at 29. And our real estate is sitting at 11.55% with a target of 11. So we're effectively maintaining our asset allocation through today. It's been a wild ride.
Well, it looks a little better than last month.
Yes, we are totally back in line, and we are approaching our beginning year balances. So that's nice.
Robert, when will we begin to see something on infrastructure?
That's kind of hard to say. We haven't gotten our calls from either of the managers yet. No capital calls. I'm hopeful within the next year we'll get a call for some of that. We're not expecting to have any sort of liquidity issues. We kind of mentioned that a meeting or two ago, just because of the nature of our funds. We're not expecting to have any sort of liquidity issue at all when they do make that call.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is there any other discussion on the preliminary monthly investment report? If not, we can move on to discussion and possible action regarding the resolution stating authorized and rescinded signatures. And I will turn that over to Doris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This resolution is simply to replace my name for James in order to have the authority to perform actions necessary for the job. If you have any questions regarding it, this should be essentially the same resolution, just with the name swapped out, that was approved when James came in 5 years ago.
Do I have a motion? I can't hear you, Kathy. You're muted.
I'm muted. I said I'll make the motion to approve the resolution.
I'll second it.
Okay. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, we're going to do a roll call vote. Judy's going to do the roll call vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'll do a roll call by name,
Okay.
please. So Ms. Shatmeyer? Sherry?
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Forrester?
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Ms. Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Cromer,
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Aye.
and Mr. Jurdy.
Yes.
Thank you. Approved.
Okay, motion passes. Okay, moving on to the next item, which is the election notification. This is from the election committee, and we have a slate, and I'm not exactly sure at this point how we're going to do. It says in this director elections shall take place during the first regular meeting of each calendar year. And so we don't have the May meeting. Due to the cancellation of the spring conference because of COVID-19, the elections will be held at the SACRS Fall Conference, November 10th to 13th, 2020 at the Renaissance Esmeralda Resort and Spa in Indian Wells. Elections will be held during the annual business meeting. The date to be discussed, or November 10th to the 13th, 2020. Okay, are there any questions regarding the elections? Seeing none, we can move on to the MSERA Trustee Education Policy, and I will again turn that over to Doris.
Actually, Madam Chair, I have a quick question regarding the SACRS item. Does the board actually need to assign a voting delegate?
Yes.
Okay, is that something that would be done at this time?
We could do it at
Or
this.
would that be done closer to November?
It's up to the discretion of the board.
I think it probably is better to wait so you know who's going.
Okay.
I don't.
All right.
Thank you. I apologize for the interruption.
No, thank you. It's important.
Although we should discuss whether or not we need a motion to approve the recommended slate of officers and direct the voting delegate to vote for those officers.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay.
So I don't know if you need to do that today. I mean, you can. It sounds like this isn't going to happen until November.
Right.
So you could vote on it today. It looked like, and I need to pull it back up. It looks like there were some other additional candidates other than the slate. So
Yeah.
I don't know if this is something that might still change. So
Yeah.
I think you have a little bit of time, but you could do it today. You might have to get into the weeds a little bit on who those other folks are.
Well,
I just looked at it now for the first time.
yeah, I think it would be helpful from that perspective to wait, because I don't know I don't know the additional candidates that well. I know Vera Williams, but I don't know Edward Robinson. So it might be helpful to get some more information on the additional candidates.
Madam Chair, would you just like this brought back at the October meeting for the motion needed?
Yeah, that would be great. If
Okay,
I
and
would
we
like
can
to
look
have,
into getting additional information.
okay. Okay, good then.
Madam Chair, I believe Judy sent out some of the information that the candidates submitted via email to all members.
Right.
Did she not?
I-
Okay.
Yeah, I got that too.
Okay.
But you can also, I believe you can call the candidates or communicate with the candidates as well. It's, to find out more. So it's really up to the pleasure of the board. If you would like to vote today, or if you would like to postpone it, it's your personal, at your personal discretion. So I don't know how everyone feels. Is everyone okay with doing this in October, or some of you would prefer to do it today? What is your pleasure on this?
I would wait till October because things may change.
Yes.
Agreed.
Okay. All
I have a
right.
question, Madam Chair. Is that just for clarity purposes, are the two regular members the only other positions that are being contested? because there's 2 on the final ballot and then 2 additional candidates submitted, but I don't see it for any other position.
I
Right.
believe you're correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to confirm. Thank you.
Okay. So then moving on to the MSARA trustee educational policy.
Thank you,
And-
Madam Chair.
Yes.
This policy is up for its review. It was last approved by the board 3 years ago. As you may recall, there is a separate travel policy that the board adopted. James had reported back that there were some issues with implementing the education travel and other travel policy, and that he was going to wait until such time as the county finished the updates to their policy to try to make them dovetail and work together a little bit more to resolve those issues with implementation of this policy. Since the county has never done that, it's taken a backseat to other issues. This was simply brought back for the board's triennial review. There were no substantive changes to this, and it's there for board action.
Hi, this is Julie. I would like to make a note that the retirement administrator should be changed in the document to executive director. And also,
Good catch, Julie.
also there's a typo in the title of education. Other than that, I don't have any comments.
That has been corrected and the correct document is posted.
I'm on the website right now and pulled that up and I don't get that one. So, but thank you.
It's not posted to our website right now. It's posted to the filer for the board. Is that correct, Judy? The revision one? Anyway, we will make sure that those changes are reflected.
I'm looking at the website now and I see the corrected version.
So is there a motion to approve of the trustee educational and travel policy?
Madam Chair, I move that we approve the proposed policy with the amended changes that were suggested by Trustee Forster.
Is there a second?
I'll
Second.
second that.
Okay, we take a roll call vote by name. Judy, please.
Ms. Shatmeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Forrester,
Yes.
Ms. Cavness,
Yes.
Mr. Parker, Mr. Parker? Yes?
He's muted.
Sorry. Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
And Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Thank you. Approved.
Okay, motion passes, and moving on to agenda item telework, the MSARA telework policy.
Again, thank you, Madam Chair. The telework policy is brought back for its triennial review. Again, there are really no substantive changes to this. The only addition was a statement that said it is viable and a voluntary policy, and that it also can be a valuable resource when there are emergency service disruptions, to have the ability for staff to work from home. As we all know, with the COVID-19 situation, MSARA staff has been working remotely pretty much up until starting to return to the office in June. And we were able to complete all necessary functions via telework, and we just want the board's readoption of this policy.
So is there a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Second?
Second.
I'll second it.
Kathy? I think
That's
Kathy.
fine.
No, it was Jerry.
Either one, it's fine. Jerry can have it.
Yeah,
Okay,
It'll prove she was in the meeting.
all right.
that's right.
Okay, Judy, could you please do a roll call vote by name?
Ms. Shatmeyer?
Yeah.
Sherry?
Gary?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I see my mute's not working. I have to do the Alt-A. So
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
So you approve?
yes.
Ms. Forrester?
Yes.
Ms. Cavanis?
Yes.
Mr. Parker?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Aye.
And Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Thank you. Approved.
Okay, motion passes. And lastly, we will go to the administrative report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the administrative report, we've attached the legislative report from the SACRS Association. It's really more about the state budget. It is there for your reference. As far as COVID-19 update, MSARA staff did a soft reopen as of June 1st. We had developed a reopening plan, which was also attached for the board's review and comments. While we have not yet started truly taking appointments yet, the plan is that membership that wishes to come in will be done by scheduled appointment only, so we can control the number of individuals in the office. And staff is doing a combination of remote work and being in the office as we phase back into operations. I have reached out to many of you, and there's a few more of you that I have yet to, but I will be hopefully reaching out and doing a little phone calls with each of you so I can get a little more information about your background and your thoughts on the system. I hope to have that completed within the next couple of weeks as far as an opportunity to speak with you all individually. And lastly, on behalf of Judy, I would like to remind that there's, I believe, a couple of Form 700 outstanding, and that due date was April 1st. So please follow up with Judy regarding that.
I will report that we did have some successful responses yesterday.
Okay, good. Were there any questions or follow up to anything on the administrative report?
I have one question. It looks like a comprehensive COVID safety plan. Is it the intent to upload that, or at least to self-certify, I should say, with the county's self-certification process?
I was aware that the county was requiring their departments and agencies to have a reopening plan. I did not know that it required filing with them, so I will follow up with them and see what they'd like. But I certainly can't.
I'm not 100% sure, but since MSARA, I think, is technically separate from the county, it might be appropriate to just go through the self-certification that a normal business would self-certify.
Okay. I'll look into that. Thank you.
Okay, so we're on to general board member discussion. So is there any discussion? I just want to thank you, Judy, again, for everything you do for MSARA and for basically coordinating these Zoom meetings. And I'm really grateful, Doris, that you're here. I'm so happy to be working with you and look forward to a lot of good, productive work.
And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah,
And you're all very welcome. Thank you for putting up with me.
Thank you for putting up with me.
Welcome again, Doris. And I must say our meetings do look better than Flo's on the Geico commercials. A little better. They're getting better.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
as far as general board discussion, I would like to bring up something that I plan on discussing with the new executive director and hopefully with staff in the near future is a bifurcated domestic relation order, which other counties have adopted. As of this time, I know certain members have discussed this with or have been told with other members of the board, and it's my intention to hopefully bring that to the board for consideration in the near future. So I will speak with the executive director and potentially staff about bringing that forward. I know some other surrounding counties to Mendocino County have already adopted that as an alternative offer for standard DROs.
Can you explain what the heck that means?
Yeah,
Do you mind if I jumped in?
Please.
I'd appreciate it.
I believe I understand it, but go ahead.
What you're referencing is the optional provision of Cyril that allows the plan to administer split accounts as opposed to shared benefit. A split account, you literally divide the member's service, et cetera, and create a separate account for that alternate payee who is essentially afforded all of the rights under the plan of the member for their portion of the benefit. What we currently do, because that optional provision has not been adopted, is we do administer shared benefit division of community property. Typically with those, there are the alternates benefits are tied to the life of the member or potentially to a survivorship tied to that. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee a life benefit to the alternate payee. There are ways to work around that if that's required by the DRO, but a split account approach basically creates that two separate accounts. So if the alternate wants to take a refund, or if the member wants to take a refund and the other one wants to draw a benefit, you can do that because they're truly treated as two separate accounts in the system. Whereas a shared benefit approach, it's either the alternate gets a portion of the refund or the alternate gets a portion of the monthly benefit.
Is there any financial impact to us?
I would need to look into that a little bit more. Technically, the administration itself of having a split account is not necessarily a cost to the system compared to the division of a split benefit. However, I could say when we looked into this in Fresno County, it required substantial modifications to our pension administration software that made it economically unfeasible for us to pursue down there. Now, with the fact that there would be upgrades coming to Pension Gold within the next few years, that might be something that could be folded into that. And I don't know if there would be a substantial cost associated with that or not, but we would need to reach out to LRS to determine if there would be cost, and if so, how much to accommodate that.
So we're looking at a lot of discussion about this before we take any action on it.
I would expect that I'll get additional information from Trustee Cromer, and that then we can look at what would be necessary board adoption at the Board of Supervisors level, if I'm not mistaken, and then also research of costs so the Board of Retirement could decide whether or not they wish to pursue it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that was my main purpose in bringing it up, is to my intention, so the other board members understand that the bifurcated benefit will give an ex-spouse the ability to pull their benefit when they want and when they would like, without waiting for the contributing member to retire. And it gives a little more freedom to the people that have ownership in our system to make that decision. And I don't have the knowledge or information regarding the potential financial cost of that either. I just know that other surrounding counties have done it, and I've been approached numerous times by contributing members about adopting a similar policy. And surrounding counties, some have just adopted the new bifurcated DRO as what they offer now, and some have kept the original DRO and now offer an additional bifurcated DRO for the ex-spouse of the contributing member.
Jeff, do you have any comments on this?
I just wanted to remind the trustees, and this little bit of discussion is okay, but it's not on the agenda. So I don't think you've gone too far, but I think we're kind of at the point where we'll consider about bringing it back. And it's certainly as a regular agenda item, you'll give it all the look that you need to.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Catherine,
Yes.
a quick question. As I dialed in this time, and obviously there are certain numbers you need to have to access the whole discussion we're having. What about people who normally would be able to pick up what we're doing via TV or sitting in the boardroom? Can interested public members listen to what we're doing or look at the experience study as we have. I think that's really important public information. And I'm wondering, oops, my cat is playing with my hair. Don't be too comfortable at home, or someone thinks that he can participate in the phone call. Anyway, what are we doing as regarding public access?
I think, what, I can't answer that question totally. I was wondering maybe that Judy has more information on that, or Doris.
Doris, if you'd like to go ahead.
Certainly. My understanding is that we're still broadcasting, so people can watch the board meeting as it occurs or after it occurs for additional information. The board packets are still distributed and published via the website, so people have access to all of the supplemental materials that the board does. There's an opportunity for them to provide via email or otherwise comments that they wish to be made into public record, although we had none in this instance. But the information is still being made available, similar to the same way the Board of Supervisors is making that information available, is my understanding. You can correct me if I have anything wrong there, Judy.
That is correct.
Okay.
And the meetings are also available for view later on. So if you want to watch this meeting again next week, you can visit our website and follow the link to YouTube and watch it on YouTube.
Well, thank you. Now
I
we
was
Good.
going to mention,
Thanks.
Judy, if you get a request, since we offer the public time at the start of the meeting to make comment, if you get a request from someone, are they given the Zoom number and allowed to tie into our meeting so they can do that?
The current process.
I would ask Jeff
we're
if that's
following.
appropriate for us to provide the connection to the meeting if someone asks for it.
So I've had the same question and I've asked staff, and it sounds like we're following what the county is doing. And for the city of Santa Rosa, we have a more robust public comment opportunity, and I think it's probably something that we should be visiting at this point in the COVID process. But it's my understanding from staff that we are following the same process for public comment that the county is, which is only email.
right.
I
So
could maybe add a little bit. I think maybe in the first few meetings it was only email, and now people have to register, I think, by 8 a.m. the morning of the meeting if they wish to speak, and they're given a phone-in number to phone in.
There we go. Okay.
To make comment on specific agenda items, but they need to contact staff prior to the start of the meeting, basically.
So I think different.
Thanks, Dan.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. And I do think that different entities are doing it differently. And so I think that it would be probably a good idea to be consistent, at least with what the county is doing. So we can talk about that offline.
okay. Well, I'm glad we brought that up because I wasn't even sure myself. I've seen, I knew the email part, but I'm not sure. We're all set to for someone to phone in and be on the Zoom. That would work too, right, Judy? They would be in a waiting room and then they would come in.
It can be allowed, and we can manage that so that they only participate for that short period of time. But again, I have not been contacted. The office has not been contacted with anyone wanting to include any public comment, which is surprising. So
Yeah.
We need to.
Yeah, I don't think we want to be in a position of waiting for somebody to want to make the comment. I think we have to take a proactive step, and we'll look at that offline. I think it's an important point.
Okay. Great. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second. Can you hear me?
Okay, the meeting is adjourned at 11:02.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you. Stay well.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
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 Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.